The Apeiron according to Aristotle, Chapter 3 of Apeiron, Anaximander on Generation and Corruption. Of all the authors who refer to Anaximander, Aristotle was closest to the Milesians in time, and therefore his reports must be considered important. The way Aristotle looks upon the early Ionian philosophers is based upon the conviction of them having a material principle. Of the first philosophers, the majority thought the principle of all things were found only in the class of matter, en hules idea. Thales is the originator of this kind of philosophy. Here, Aristotle presupposes his own philosophy of nature, in which he distinguishes four principles or causes, one of which is matter. This is also relevant for his interpretation of the boundless. Quote, in the fourfold scheme of causes, it is plain that the boundless, to Apeiron, is a cause, haition, in the sense of matter, hos hule. And it is also clear that the boundless is not something in which and by itself, but an attribute of something else, and more precisely, a negative attribute, styresis. That of which it is an attribute is the sensible continuum. All thinkers, too, have treated the boundless as matter. End quote. Aristotle's Physics. In Aristotle's entire corpus, we find only four places in which Anaximander is expressly referenced to. Aristotle mentions him twice in the Physics and once in the Metaphysics. A passage from the treatise De Caelo concerns the issue of the motionless position of the earth at the center of the universe, which we shall leave aside. The first of the references in the Physics is related to Aristotle's distinction of various manners of creation, which were allegedly proposed by the natural philosophers. He distinguishes two groups of natural philosophers in the passage we quoted in the preceding chapter. Quote, as the natural philosophers maintain, there are two ways to account for change. Some make the underlying body one of the three elements or something else which is denser than fire but finer than air, and they generate the other things by condensation and rarefaction so as to produce a plurality. The others separate out the contraries from the one in which they are present, as does Anaximander. For everyone who says there is one and a many, such as Empedocles and Exagoras, for from the mixture they too separate out everything else. End quote. In this text, Aristotle clearly frames those thinkers that he calls natural philosophers, including Anaximander, against the background of the theory of elements, including a rather mysterious in-between element. It is noteworthy that Anaximander is said to belong to the second group, together with Empedocles and Exagoras, who start generation from a mixture of elements, and not to the first group, where one could probably include other Milesians, who start generation from one element. Before we continue our analysis of the passage of the Physics, we will pay attention to one influential interpretation of to Apeiron based on the theory of the elements. In various places in his writing, Aristotle mentions an element or something that should be placed between to metaxou, to meson, the other elements. On this issue of the element in between, Aristotle is far from consistent. It even seems as if there could be three such in-between elements, since it is placed either between fire and air, or between air and water, or between water and fire. Aristotle refers to the middle element in 9 places. In Physics 203a18, he says it is, quote, between air and water. In Physics 187a14, it is between fire and air. In physics 205a27, and in De Kylo, and in meteorology, he calls it denser than air but rarer than water. In De Kylo and generation and meteorology, denser than fire but rarer than air. In the physics, it is between water and fire. And finally, in generation and corruption, it is between air and water, or between air and fire, and denser than air and fire, but finer than the others. Perhaps it is relevant that Aristotle, in this context, once speaks of the three familiar elements, and not of the four as one might expect. Antiquity had already bore witness to some uncertainty about which thinker Aristotle intended to refer to in mentioning the in-between element. The following passage suggests that at least one thinker could be considered as a candidate to be interpreted in this way. The physicists, on the one hand, all make some nature one of their so-called elements, water or air or the intermediate between these, a subject of which unlimited is predicated. According to the above passage, in physics 187a 12 through 23, however, the in-between element cannot be Anaximander's principle. This had already led Simplicius and Philoponus to consider it more appropriate to reshuffle the text. Wicksteed and Cornfield, too, think that a rearrangement of the text is necessary so that an Anaximander comes to be associated with the first group. Kahn points to the fact that the in-between element is always referred to, varying within the context, as between water, air, and fire, which are the principles of the Ionian monists Thales, Anaximenes, and Heraclitus. Here, too, Anaximander is absent, just like in the first book of the Metaphysics, where the in-between element is also mentioned. Kahn maintains that, quote, the possibility of this total omission corresponding to the mention of the comparable but unattested theory seems too remote to be seriously entertained, end quote. This sounds as if Aristotle intentionally created a kind of cryptograph, asking his readers to find the missing name and offering the in-between element as a cue. Against these reconstructions, KRS state, quote, on the only possible interpretation, Aristotle placed the intermediate substance and Anaximander in opposite groups, end quote. Similarly, Conchoconclades, quote, the doctrine of intermediary elements as principles of beings is not a tenet of Anaximander. It is not an attribution, but rather a refusal by Aristotle. It should be noted that in Aristotle's own theory, the in-between element plays no role whatsoever. Aristotle also never mentions Anaximander by name when he talks about the in-between element. It may have been a concept proposed by the students of the Lyceum, which Aristotle then discussed and opposed. But most likely it is just an element of the manner in which the Peripatetics tried to mold their predecessors according to their own theories. Perhaps the best way to cope with this matter is worded in KRS, quote, a careful study of all Aristotle's references indicates that Anaximander was, after all, in his mind, although Anaximander in fact held no such theory. Aristotle evidently felt that Anaximanders, for Aristotle, infinite, arche, must have had some expressible relation to the so-called elements, end quote. In favor of this, it could be adduced that in De Kylo, the reference to an in-between element is followed by words that remind Alexander of Aphrodisias of Anaximander. Quote, some philosophers posit one element alone, either water or air or fire, or something rarer than water but denser than air, and this, they say, embraces all worlds, being boundless. Elsewhere, such a something in between seems to be linked to the argument that the boundless cannot be one of the elements because they, or at least those taken to be the physicists, destroy each other, being boundless. Quote, and the unlimited element would have destroyed its opposites, as we have said above. And this is the reason why no one of the physicists has taken fire or earth as unlimited unity, but water or air as something in between that has always been selected. Fire and earth have each a distinct region about which there could be no mistake, whereas water and air appear to be susceptible to movement either up or down. End quote. Sometimes Aristotle does not speak of an in-between element, but uses the more vague expression, besides them. The following passage features words that are, again, reminders of Anaximander. Quote, there is no one of these elements from which everything comes, nor indeed is there something else besides them. For instance, between, maison t, air and water, or air and fire, which is denser than air and fire, but finer than the others. So it is never possible for the alleged source to exist by itself, as some claim about the boundless and the surrounding. End quote. The same expression plays a role in the second passage that contains an argument for understanding the boundless as principle, which Aristotle fights against. One that had been related, both in ancient and modern times, to Anaximander. Quote, but if the infinite body cannot be composed, neither is it not possible that the infinite body be one and uniform, either, as some say, as something beyond the elements, out of which these come into being, nor in any way at all. For there are some who posit the infinite body, and not, for instance, air or water, in order that the others may not be destroyed, but one among them being infinite. For each of these has a character contrary to the others. For instance, air is cold, water moist, fire hot. So, if any one of these was infinite, the rest would already have to be destroyed. But it is really something else, heteron, they say, from which these things arise. But no such sensible body exists in addition to the so-called elements. End quote. There seems to be an interesting difference in nuance between the meanings of para, beyond, in the two passages from Aristotle. In the passage from Generation and Corruption, the expression allo ti para tauta clearly refers to the elements that are mentioned immediately thereafter. So the translation, beside them, is obvious. In physics, on the contrary, para ta stoicheia cannot refer to an in-between element because the same argument for why it cannot be boundless would hold. If it were boundless, the other elements would cease to exist. Elsewhere in Generation and Corruption, Aristotle uses choriston as a synonym for para, a word he also uses to indicate Plato's ideas. Quote, some people assert the matter underlying these bodies is one. For example, they hold it to be air or fire or an intermediary between these two, but still a separate body. But those who postulate that there is a single matter beside the bodies which we have mentioned, and that is corporeal and separable, are mistaken. In this passage, the one body that some natural philosophers claim as arche, be it air, fire, or whatever, is said to be separate because everything else is thought to be generated from it. This is why we translate para as beyond and in addition to, According to the opinion of those described there by Aristotle, that which is boundless must be beyond, and thus not in between or beside the elements, because these are said to be generated from it. KRS fails to see this different meaning when writing with explicit reference to Physics 204b 22 to 33. Quote, there are some passages in which he wrote simply of to para ta stoichia, that which is beside the elements, not identifiable with any one of them, and not of to metaxu or to meson. Returning to the passage from Physics, at the very end we find a reference to mixture. However, it is not clear whether this reference applies to Anaximander as well. One might argue that within the second group, Aristotle distinguishes between Anaximander, for whom the opposites are present in the one, and Empedocles and Anaxagoras, for whom the opposites form a mixture. However, in the second chapter of the seventh book of the Metaphysics, Anaximander is again explicitly named, and once again in connection with a mixture. The passage from Physics is here generalized, and Aristotle tries to demonstrate that the above-mentioned thinkers anticipated his concept of matter. Quote, hence, not only may there be generation accidentally from that which is not, but also everything is generated from that which is, but is potentially and is not actually. And this is the one of Anaxagoras. For his, quote, all things were together, and the mixture, tomigma, of Empedocles and Anaximander, and the doctrine of Democritus would be better expressed as, quote, all things were together potentially, but not actually, end quote. Yet, doubts have arisen whether in this piece of text mixture should be applied to Anaximander. Jackson proposes placing tomigma between commas so that the text reads Empedocles, mixture, and Anaximander, which makes tomigma relate to Empedocles only. However, this may be. It is important to note that in neither passage does Aristotle mean to Apeiron. The only passage where Aristotle speaks of Anaximander in connection with to Apeiron is found in the fourth chapter of the third book of the Physics, which deals with motion, but also with the boundless, the infinite, the unlimited. At the beginning of the chapter, Aristotle emphasizes that, quote, all philosophers of repute who have dealt with physics have discussed the boundless, and all have regarded it as, in some sense, a principle of actually existing things, end quote. And while the Pythagoreans and Plato believe it to be the very substance, those who speak about nature, that is, the physicists, treat it as a property, an attribute. Aristotle then repeats, immediately before the passage that interests us, that the investigation of the boundless should be described to the physicists, adding that all who thought the boundless to be the arche were quite right. Quote, everything is either a source, arche, or derived from a source, and there is no source of the boundless, for then there would be a boundary of it. Furthermore, it would be without coming to be and perishing insofar as it is a source, for what comes to be must reach an end, and there is an end of every perishing. For that reason, as we said already, there is no source of the boundless, but this is apparently the source of everything else, and to contain all things and steer all things, as everyone claims, who does not posit some cause next to the boundless. For instance, mind or love. And this is the divine, for it is deathless and imperishable, as Anaximander says, together with the majority of the natural philosophers. End quote. The argument in the above-quoted passage has been occasionally believed to be genuinely Anaximanderian. It certainly does not reflect Aristotle's own view, but the structure of the argumentation could also be considered as Aristotle's interpretation of Eleatic or Milesian reasoning. Melissus specifically treats the issue of boundless in a similar way. He uses the same starting assumptions, namely that what is created has both arche and telos. Quote, "Now, since it did not come to be, but is, it always was and always will be, and it has no beginning nor end, but is unlimited, Apeiron. For if it came to be, it would have a beginning, for it would have begun to come to be at some point. But since it did not begin nor end, it always was and always will be, and it has no beginning nor end. For what is not entire, pan, cannot be always." End quote. Whereas in Aristotle's text, the eternity of the boundless is deduced from its boundlessness. Melissus deduced its boundlessness from the fact that it has no beginning or end in time, because only that which has no beginning nor end can both permanently exist and be boundless in size. Kahn, who claims that this argument should be ascribed to Anaximander, points both to Aristotle's own criticism of Melissus' argument and to the fact that Melissus certainly did not believe the boundless to be arche to allon, which is the main intention behind Aristotle's text. Of some interest in this context is also a parallel from the Phaedrus, where Plato argues for the immortality of the soul based on its permanent movement. Quote, "But the beginning is ungenerated, for everything that is generated must be generated from a beginning. But the beginning is not generated from anything, for if the beginning were generated from anything, it would not be generated from a beginning. And since it is ungenerated, it must be also indestructible. For if the beginning were destroyed, it could never be generated from anything nor anything else from it. Since all things must be generated from a beginning, thus that which moves itself must be the beginning of motion." End quote. Yet we do not believe that the argument presented by Melissus and repeated in one way or another by Plato and Aristotle goes further back than the mid-5th century BC. It does not reflect a style typical of Ionian thought, which is not so much occupied with abstract arguing, but rather one which makes use of analogies and images. It does not seem likely, therefore, that Anaximander actually used such an abstract and sophisticated style of argumentation. Moreover, it can be argued that the reference to Anaximander here only concerns the qualification divine, deathless, and imperishable. Kahn's remarks that, quote, "In fact, only for Anaximander alone could it be correct to say that to Apeiron is arche, which surrounds all things," end quote, does not necessarily imply that he seems to think that Anaximander used the foregoing argument that allegedly would prove the assertion. In reference to Anaximander's principle, less dispute are the qualifications that, quote, "there is no source for the boundless," and, quote, "it contains all things and steers all things," as well as, quote, "the divine," and, quote, "deathless and imperishable." The Diels-Kranz edition even assumes that these are Anaximander's own words. It needs to be stressed that the quoted passage in the Physics is the only place in Aristotle's writing where Anaximander is mentioned in connection to Apeiron. But are we, based on this one passage, justified in claiming that Aristotle ascribes to Anaximander a principle in the form of Apeiron? We do not believe so, despite the fact that Anaximander is expressly named. One needs to take into account that the whole chapter deals with the boundless, and after all, Aristotle repeatedly claims that all natural philosophers investigated the boundless and thought it to be a principle. Moreover, at the beginning of his text, Aristotle refers to natural philosophers in the plural, and Anaximander is mentioned only towards the end, where to Apeiron is given divine attributes. Even here, the Milesian is not explicitly mentioned in connection with to Apeiron being a principle. Rather, the reference to him is primarily in the context of the divinity of the boundless. Aristotle emphasizes this point, saying that to Apeiron is deathless and imperishable. The words "as says" most likely refers to the phrase deathless and imperishable, with which deals Marx as Anaximander's fragment. 12b3. It seems that what Aristotle wanted to show was that most of his predecessors believed the origin to be divine, emphasis on divinity and not on the boundless as the origin. Thus seems to be the thing that Aristotle primarily connects with Anaximander. But even there, the claim is ascribed not to him expressly, but to natural philosophers in general. Anaximander is mentioned together with other thinkers, and though he is the oldest of the group, the subject is not linked exclusively to him. Taken together, these considerations may indicate that the whole passage should be seen as Aristotle's concoction of various pre-Socratic teachings, of which only the last clause can be ascribed more especially to Anaximander. Actually, Aristotle's generalization says no more than that the natural philosophers understood their arche as boundless. Immediately after the quoted crucial passage in Physics 203b, Aristotle lists 5 reasons for supposing the existence of the boundless. These reasons reflect older, archaic conceptions of different schools of philosophers, albeit in Aristotelian terms. The third, repeated by Theophrastus and several doxographers, answers the question, why did the early philosophers choose boundless as a predicate of their principle? The answer is supposed to be applicable to Anaximander as well, in that the need for an everlasting source that never gives in order to guarantee an ongoing process. Aristotle writes, quote, "The belief in something boundless, T Apeiron, which seems to arise especially from 5 considerations. Number 3, from the fact that only in this way will coming to be and perishing not cease, so long as that which what comes to be proceeds is boundless." End quote. In Aristotle's material reading, to Apeiron is supposed to be the inexhaustible source of all creation, which, thanks to it, will never cease. A fountain that will never run dry. This notion is one he criticizes. Quote, "Admitting that things never cease to come to be, it does not follow that there actually exists some sensible body unlimited in quantity. For though the sum of all things be limited, things may come out of and pass into each other." End quote. That Aristotle calls the argument unconvincing at least indicates that someone else had use of it. Other texts, obviously echoing Aristotle and probably going back to Theophrastus, identify this someone as Anaximander. Quote, "Anaximander, son of Praxiades of Miletus, says that boundless is the source of existing things. Thus he tells why it is boundless, in order that the coming to be which occurs may never cease." End quote. Simplicius supports this explanation. Quote, "Anaximander, a fellow citizen and associate of Thales, was the first to postulate the boundless in order to provide abundantly for things coming to be." End quote. Most modern scholars also agree that Aristotle must have had Anaximander in mind, and that Apeiron soma aistheton refers to a boundless source that guarantees the permanence of the process of creation. Kahn, who argues that the argument presented in Physics 203b must go back to Anaximander himself, even ventures to state that Anaximander, quote, called the unknown world source ton Apeiron, that which is inexhaustible, thus making inexhaustible almost a translation of Apeiros. Dürnsen, on the other hand, followed the analysis of Lebedev and Helling, has recently come to the conclusion that to Apeiron is one of the substantive technical terms introduced by Aristotle. In his own theory, Aristotle admits only a potential infinity and explicitly rejects a boundless as a principle. It is further manifest that the boundless cannot exist as an actualized entity and as substance or principle. In other words, in Aristotle's view, if there were an actual boundless, all parts of it would also have to be boundless, just as every part of air is air. The boundless is thus indivisible without parts, and therefore just an attribute. Quote, the boundless then must exist, if at all, attributively, kata sumbebikos. But in that case, it has been shown that it cannot be boundless itself, that is a principle, but the boundless thing of which boundless is an attribute, ho sumbebike, as some kind of predicate of air or of an even number. End quote. To Aristotle, to Apeiron represents a separate problem he deals with in chapters 4 and 8 of the books of the physics, of the third book of the physics. He sees it as a part of natural science because natural science deals with size, movement, and time, which can all be either limited or boundless. According to Aristotle, this claim is supported by the fact that all thinkers who engage in natural science also provide various conceptions of the boundless. Quote, all philosophers of repute who dealt with physics have discussed the boundless and have all regarded it as, in some sense, a principle of actually existing things. Some, such as the Pythagoreans and Plato, have regarded the boundless or undetermined as existing in itself and not as being a condition incident to something else, but having its own independent substantive existence. The physicists, on the other hand, all make some other nature, one of their so-called elements, water or air or the intermediate between these, a subject of which boundless is a predicate. End quote. Here, Aristotle makes an important distinction between the Pythagoreans and Plato on the one hand and natural philosophers on the other. While the first group viewed the boundless as a substance, the other treated it as just a property, an attribute of one of the elements, including the in-between element. Though the passage is formulated in general terms, we cannot infer that, according to Aristotle, no thinker prior to Plato, with the exception of mainly the Pythagoreans, who are in this sense mentioned only in the Metaphysics, viewed the boundless as a substance. Rather, it was seen as an attribute of something else, de facto a property of this or that element. Obviously, Aristotle had the Ionian philosophers in mind in the first place, of which, for example, Anaximenes called his principle, the air, boundless. Since Anaximander did not belong to the first group, it implies that he belonged to the latter. Somewhat later on, Anaximander is explicitly named together with the majority of the natural philosophers, physiologoi. According to de Vogel, this, quote, means that Anaximander, being one of the parifusios, the Apeiron is not a subject but a predicate. More than 20 years later, the same conclusion is drawn by Lebedev from a study of the same text. Quote, in the language of grammar, this means that only the Pythagoreans and Plato substantivized the adjective Apeiron, while all other philosophers use the term precisely as an adjective modifying another substantive. Aristotle clearly tries to show here that the so-called natural philosophers must be seen as his forerunners, since they, too, conceive of the Apeiron as an attribute. It is important to note that Aristotle still speaks of to Apeiron even when he, in referring to the natural philosophers, stresses that they use the word attributively, in which case it would be logical to expect the adjective Apeiron. We may compare it with present-day English expressions like the Almighty, meaning the Almighty God, or more profane ones like the good, the bad, and the ugly, meaning the good man, the bad man, and the ugly man. These words are not meant to as abstracta, but rather indicate specific objects or persons by means of their characteristic attributes. One might perhaps argue that this reflects the vernacular of the ancient philosophers, or even Anaximander in particular. In fragment 12b of Anaximander, we find the phrase kata to kreon, where similarly the word kreon is not, prior to Anaximander, attested anywhere with an article. Kahn remarks that this is not surprising for an author who also used not only to Apeiron, but also to thermon, to psukron, to hegeron. We might add to theon and to gonimon, and possibly to pariekon and ta onta. The hot, the cold, the moist, etc., and the divine, the wise, the containing being. However, if there is reasonable doubt whether Anaximander used to Apeiron as a noun, and taking into account that these other words are part of the rendition of Anaximander's cosmology by Simplicius and others, the substantive expression kata to kreon stands by itself. Consequently, Havelock argues that it, too, does not represent the original language of Anaximander. However this may be, we may conclude that when Aristotle, talking about the natural philosophers, including Anaximander, speaks of to Apeiron, he actually refers to this attributive use of the noun. Therefore, the best way to render the meaning of to Apeiron in Anaximander and the other natural philosophers is that which is called boundless. This is exactly what Aristotle points to in another of the passages we quoted earlier, just after having mentioned Anaximander. Quote, "As says Anaximander and most of the natural philosophers, the belief in the existence of something boundless." End quote. Graham translates less precisely, quote, "the belief in some infinite principle," whereas Wicksteed and Cornfield specifically, more literally, say, quote, "the belief in the existence of something infinite," end quote. Also, when Aristotle repeats, quote, "clearly then the study of the boundless is germane to the natural philosophers, all those who accept it are quite right in regarding it as a principle," end quote. We must remember that he has already stipulated that the natural philosophers all consider the boundless as an attribute, so that we have to understand the boundless, as stated before, as, quote, "that which is called boundless, something boundless, t Apeiron." We may conclude from this analysis of the relevant text that Aristotle's work does not provide us with convincing evidence that would link Anaximander with a principle called the boundless. We have seen that Aristotle refers to Anaximander's principle using terms such as one or mixture, and that he points to a connection between Anaximander's philosophy and the theories of Anaxagoras and Empedocles. If we did not have another tradition based on Theophrastus at our disposal and had to do with just Aristotle's work, it is unlikely that the boundless would be so frequently named as Anaximander's principle. We have also seen that, on the other hand, Aristotle's texts do not exclude the idea that Anaximander used the expression the boundless attributively indicating something that is called boundless, and which can be considered in some way or another as everlasting source of everything. Obviously, when boundless must be understood as an attribute of something else, the question arises which noun it might be an attribute of. Before paying attention to this fundamental question, we will first turn to Aristotle's successor Theophrastus and to the tradition that originates from this work in order to determine whatever information can be drawn from that source. And the authors go on to show that it is boundless nature, that to apeiros is the adjective that modifies phusis, nature.